Ah, n'a pas pu venir. So, dear colleagues, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Claude Apokavi. I work here in the ILO, and I'm special advisor to the Deputy Director General for Field Operations and for Partnerships. And it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon to chair this very important session. And I think that this session really brings everything together in a very dynamic way because it underlines the part of the theme which talks about we want. What do we want? Because as you all know, currently our development model is driven by a high carbon growth. We are using more resources than is sustainable for our planet, and this is undermining the welfare of future generations. And what do you have to show for this? We still have unacceptably high levels of extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is still in the range of over something in the region of 800 million. We have high levels of inequality. 8 men own the same wealth as half of the world's population, that is 3.6 billion people. Our oceans are polluted with plastics. And then since the last financial crisis, we are yet to recover the same job levels as before the crisis. The informal economy is still exploding across the world. So we don't have much to show for it in terms of social progress, human development, and human welfare across the globe. This is the agenda that in 2015, the 193 member states of the United Nations tried to tackle, tried to change the development paradigm, tried to make it much more sustainable. And in 2015, they adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which consisted of a declaration, a set of 17 goals to be achieved. And each goal was broken down into targets and a set of indicators to measure progress in achieving the goals. Now, these goals were aligned by a set of 5 key principles. The fact that the compact was not a compact for developing countries alone, it was a universal compact. It's a compact for all countries, because this is about shifting the development model, shifting the development paradigm. And it can't be for only a set of countries. It has to be a universal shift in paradigm. A second key principle was that it was based on the concept of sustainability, in the sense that it was based on the 3 pillars of sustainability: the economic, the social, and the environmental. A third important pillar or principle of this agenda was the commitment to leave no one behind. That means the poorest of the poor had to be brought along and had to be brought up in a priority manner to leave their conditions of poverty and marginalization. A fourth important principle, which is very important for the trade unions that you are, is that it's based on a principle of participation. Participation of all, including civil society, and that includes trade unions. And in fact, in the lead up to the adoption of this agenda, you had a major group of workers and trade unions that lobbied the different member states on the positions that they had to take and include in this agenda. And the last key principle or objective of this agenda is that it sought transformational change. It endorsed the idea that the world needed to have a transformation from what we are going through currently. Because like I just enumerated, we are going through this process of high carbon growth, and the results are not very, very convincing. If you look at the whole of the planet, maybe for certain parts of the world, it's okay, but for the whole planet, it is not convincing. And so the world needed a transformational change. We need a shift in development paradigm. So these are the background for those who are not aware of the 2030 agenda, some of the key elements of this agenda. And For us in the ILO, there are a number of goals that are linked to our mandate, but the first and most important goal is Goal 8, which seeks to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. And this is important. So it's not just about growth. It's about sustained growth, inclusive growth. It's about sustainable growth. That growth must not undermine the environment. That growth must be inclusive. And it ends by saying it must not be jobless growth. It must be growth that produces decent work for all, full and productive employment for all. But this is not the only goal which is important for the ILO. There are a series of other goals which are relevant to our mandate. For instance, Goal 1, to end poverty in all its forms, which is, of course, very important for us, which is a constitutional mandate for us. Goal 5, to achieve gender equality and empower women and girls. This is fundamental for us. It's a mainstream objective for us, a cross-cutting objective for us. Goal 10, to reduce inequality within and among countries. Now, this is also very, very important for us. And in fact, one of the mechanisms to reduce this inequality is through wage policies, through social protection. Goal 16, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. And I'd really encourage you to go through these goals, to understand them, and to use them. But above all else, to be involved in your countries in because all countries have to develop national SDG strategies. So this is what we're going to talk about. And to help us in this discussion, we have an illustrious panel to help us understand this agenda, and particularly its linkages with the theme of our symposium, the future of work that we want. First of all, we have Lais Abramo, who is chief of social development of the Social Development Division of CEPAL in Chile. We have through Skype Vinicius Pinheiro, who is the director of the ILO office to the United Nations in New York. We have also Ariel Castro, who is a focal point on SDGs and in ACTRAV, and amongst other responsibilities that he has. Also we have, as a discussant, Tonia Novic from the University of Bristol to kind of give a kind of outside view critique of what will be said by our keynote speakers. We've asked our speakers to address, so what we propose is 2 sets of questions which our speakers will address, and we'll listen to the discussants, and then we'll give the floor to you around a central question of how trade unions can influence the future direction of this agenda. So the first question then I'll start off with, Lais, is how are the current progress and challenges affecting the prospects of achieving the SDGs in 2030? Are we on track? Can we do it? Can we achieve these laudable goals?
Hello, thank you. Muy buenas tardes. Boa tarde, Vinícius. Perdão, excuse me for the Portuguese, but I'm very happy to be here again in this special dialogue. Estou representando acá
Here I'm representing the Executive Secretary of ACTRAV, who can't be here today. I'm going to try to immediately go into the subject. This very suggestive question, trying to also follow the style of what's been these 2 days' discussions, perhaps make a few provocative comments to foster discussion. If we consider that the central efforts of 2030 are to eradicate poverty in all its forms and in all places, decrease inequality between countries and within countries, leaving no one behind, the theme of decent work, and of course ILO action, the action of trade unions is key. In 2001, after defining a decent work as a slogan to promote equality from decent work, to promote social justice and universal peace. The memorandum of Juan Antonio Somavia, who was then Secretary General of the ILO, said that decent work was the central focus for combating poverty. When this wasn't clear in the MDGs, which had been adopted in the previous year by the UN General Assembly, and it was a much less ambitious agenda than Agenda 2030, as the director of ACTRAV said, that now it's a universal agenda that inclusive of all countries. And as was pointed out yesterday, the important outcomes of elimination of poverty and extreme poverty, inequality, social injustice, which occurs in Latin America from 2004 to 2014, have been achieved due to corrections in the labor market, in addition to policies to extend social protection coverage, which has also been very important. Therefore, as also was said, in addition to Objective 8, Agenda 2030 is much more ambitious in relation to the eradication of poverty and placing equality at the very heart of it, as well as the theme of decent work. I very much agree that it's not just a question of SDG 8, but decent work is contained in other SDGs. And I could also mention the theme of education. There's a very important stress in technical vocational training, health. This is also health at the workplace and many other subjects, as well as the also the subject of oceans. When we talk about the quality of oceans, it's very important to also for fostering the proper living conditions of workers. The agenda is universal, and it talks about the necessary link between the SDGs. We must also think about it with this broad vision. We in ECLAC, talking about social justice, we talk about the social pillar of Agenda 2030, which are those with a specific social character, the end of hunger, the end of poverty, equality for all, gender equality, decent work, but also we consider social progress is fundamental in complying with the economic and social objectives. So if we talk about an agenda of decent work linked up with Agenda 2030, now the question asked me by the coordinator, can we achieve the SDGs? I think here there's a central theme which ECLAC has given a reading of Agenda 2030 from the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, and the first thing it says is the follows. The present level of development is unsustainable, economically, socially, and politically. The coordinator already gave an example. There is global increasing inequality. 8 individuals have the income of equivalent to 3% of the population. So if we're also talking about the future of work, we have to consider these factors. There's an increased environmental crisis, which is reflected in climate change, and the so-called natural disasters, which are in fact caused by certain levels of development. The weakness of national states in reducing the effects of harmful effects of the financial crisis. When we talk about globalization, we have to talk about the theme of financing, which is very important. The ILO talks about it in terms of the real economy, and we also say that there's a melting pot of the level of economic development. We have carbon sinks, and we also talk about the harmful effects on the environment, which are associated with this model of social development. We also have to talk about the negative social effects of, and we're talking about, for example, poverty, famine, the exploitation, the tremendous deficits in decent work that we've talked about over the 2 years. If this continues, we'll be unable to achieve the sustainable development goals. So from ECLAC, we've been making certain general ambitious proposals because the agenda, as I said, is ambitious. I'm going to summarize our objectives. We talk about the need for a progressive structural change with a major emphasis on the environment, the emphasis on inclusive development, recover and strengthen the role of the governments, the regulatory role, distributive role of the state, strengthen national, regional, and international associations, organizations, protect productive and social investment, looking at less regressive distributive systems, and transit from a culture of privilege to a culture of equality, advancing
y de pactos para la igualdad.
and looking at further pacts for equality. I'm going to try to speak very quickly about some of the challenges when ECLAC talks about a progressive or gradual structural change. It's talking about, in fact, the need to diversify the productive structure, decreasing, I'm talking from a Latin American perspective, decreasing the dependence on natural resources, including new technologies in the productive processes, but also trying to ensure that these technologies are distributed in a less inequitable way throughout the social structure, increasing production and lowering inequalities between the various structures. Increasing production, not indefinitely extending the workday of workers, but having machinery that's more effective, for example.
Pero también es
It's also very important, this structural change, the change in the productive structure, has to be given also a major environmental impetus when you talk about, for example, a fair transition to a low-carbon economy, to make sure that this productive impetus also be done respecting the environment, which someone call a green economy. Change the modes of production to ensure that they are more user-friendly, more environmentally friendly. And I think there's a very important ILO formulation to talk about green jobs, decent work, which contributes to environmental conservation. Obviously, children collecting waste for recycling, that is not in any way a green job. This has to be decent work, which also contributes to environmental preservation. I think this is a very important factor. It's a possible avenue for discussions of very powerful proposals, and I think that is changing the productive model with a major environmental emphasis, but this also contains challenges for the trade unions, which are the capacity of actors in the workplace to anticipate these changes and to adapt educational systems as well as vocational training programs to face the new challenges of acquiring new skills, environmental change, producing decent jobs, changing the productive structure in labor markets, and strengthening social inclusion to make it possible that this transition toward a sustainable economy happens without prejudice to the workers. And the other theme of social inclusive development, here we're talking, in fact, precisely about the need to reach a level of social development without leaving anyone behind. As I was talking about the matrix of social inequality, we have to talk about inequalities, not only class inequalities or economic inequalities, but territorial inequalities, gender inequalities, racial inequalities and inequalities in the life cycle, which these are this series of inequalities which interact with each other, and we know that cause that many people are to be victims of this inequality living below the poverty level. So when we're talking about inequality, we're talking about universal public health, SDG 3 and 4, integral systems for social protection aimed at universality without pointing to differences. It's very important to promote the universality and the rights of all, and all particular attention to the layers of population who suffer from additional or far-reaching barriers in having access, including in countries where there is quality education. There's still no universal education. There's still sectors which are outside. So affirmative action policies have to be set up to overcome these barriers and enabling access of those who have been left behind to become included. And this is what we call universality, which is sensitive to differences. Developing the productive sector, promoting decent work. We also discussed the role of decent work in social inclusion, in overcoming poverty, but at the same time, we can't leave aside implementing social policies also within those aimed at overcoming poverty, because these have to do with fundamental human rights of the population, health, education, and social protection. And finally, other two challenges which I wanted to mention. The theme of the means of implementation. Agenda 23 talks about the means of implementation. In other words, how to move from this agenda, which is a generous one, an ambitious one, which is inclusive, inspirational, to something which is made concrete and achieves concrete results. Well, the means of implementation, what are they? Institutions, policies, data, statistics. That's a very important 16.8 SDG, which talks about the inclusion of all indicators based on gender, age, territory, and so on. Not all countries have this capacity. It's very important to strengthen this institutional capacity to take the necessary measures, and financing. So with what resources are we going to do all this? And here, well, there are calculations of how much we'd need to comply with the Sustainable Development Goals. But for Latin America, what ACTRAV pays attention to is first, it's necessary. Well, we're in a very complex period in Latin America, in the world as a whole, but in Latin America with low rates of economic growth, with policies of structural adjustment, which restrict public expenditure. We talk about the need for caution in regards to public expenditure, investment as social investment, which as something which is fundamental in this regard, and how, among others, just to give you a fact that I think is very important, in Latin America, where people are taxed poorly and not well. In other words, the levels of taxation are usually less than 23% of the GDP as compared to 34 or 38% as the OECD average. But in addition, it's poor tax collection because it's a very regressive taxation system. The persons with the most resources that pay the lower taxes, relatively speaking. So it's very important to move towards a less regressive tax system. ECLAC considers that the lack of compliance with what one should pay in terms of taxes is equivalent to 34 billion years a year. In other words, 7.6% of the GDP in Latin America corresponds to tax evasion, or avoidance. If we compare with innovations in Latin America to combat poverty, which had very important results, relating monetary poverty and improving health and education indicators for children. Well, what is the cost of this in Latin America? As my colleague yesterday said, there are approximately 132 million persons in Latin America who participate in these programs, and 1 out of each 20 households in Latin America refers these transfer funds. And this is less than 0.5% of the GDP. So if we compared this 0.5% with the 6.7% of tax avoidance, so where's the solution? So this is a subject. If we don't make progress here, we're not going to be able to comply with the SDGs. And to complete this, we talk about the need to urgently transit from a culture of privilege to a culture of equality, and to move toward a new social consensus and pacts for equality in social, labor, and policy issues. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we say they are linked to this productive matrix, but also a culture of privilege, which is a power constitutional root of our historical, social, and cultural background, and perpetuates inequality. The culture of privilege, which is symbolic, which interacts with established practices and are considered acceptable and become natural in a group of the population, has special advantages vis-a-vis the rest of society, which creates an imbalance of one of the following characteristics: their social class, their racial condition or gender quality, their belonging to certain cultural entities. The culture of privilege also implies a naturalized asymmetry in rights and obligations of the citizenship, which reproduces enormous inequalities in terms of entitlement to rights and representation, participation in political life, and the benefits of economic, social, and cultural progress. This is rooted in the colonization process in Latin America of slavery that lasted 400 years in our region, the exploitation of low-cost labor, and was not entirely overcome by modernization. We still see this reproduced in culture and institutions, and it's based on the negation of the other person. It can be the worker, especially low-skilled workers, women, indigenous people, migrant workers, and farmers. So democratic progress, fundamental rights, and social reform of an inclusive and distributive way, which occurred in the last decade in the region or more, say some 20 or 30 years ago, contributed to questioning this culture of privileges. But it's certainly not yet solved. I think today we also can see strong reaction of the culture of privilege to this process of poverty reduction, inequality reduction, and social inclusion in the last decade. This reaction is one of the elements that is a threat to progress in recent periods, seeking to reinstate privileges and new ways to put a brake on social progress. So we have to create new consensus, new agreements on equality, and promote the fundamental rights of all persons. Everyone deserves, or all workers deserve, having a system of social protection which guarantees well-being and treatment of illness and elderly age. And so we have to make progress in these social covenants. And in this sense, the Agenda 2030 has to do with work. It has to be a very broad agenda, like in the ILO. The various dimensions of decent work. It's not just having jobs, but the quality of jobs, rights in the workplace, conciliation in work-life, social protection. This is a crucial subject. Otherwise, we will not be able to comply with the SDG, and this is very central. The role of trade unions is absolutely key here because they represent the workers, men and women, who are among those who must not be left behind. And as we've seen before in all the discussions of these 2 days. There systems of polarization and exclusion are continuing, and this simply impedes progress, such as it's defined in the 2030 agenda, in which all countries, or the large majority of the countries, have committed to. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that most exhaustive presentation, and thank you also exactly for sharing a lot about what CEPAL's perspective on this, the issues related to structural change, inclusive development, re-establishing the regulatory and redistributive role of the state, and protecting social investment. And I'd like to pass the floor to Vinicius, who is in our office in New York. You have the floor to address the first question, and then you have a second round of a chance to address the second question. So, Vinicius, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Claude, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you back, Lais. Thank you so much for inviting the ILO in New York to join you in this conversation. As you know, our job here is to make sure decent work and the ILO-related issues, they have a prominent role and they have a prominent positioning at the UN. So when you see that decent work agenda is so well reflected in the SDGs and the 2030 agenda, this is not a given. This is a result of concerted action, including trade unions and some other things that we do here in New York. We also connect with the rest of the UN system. As you know, we live in a big family with brothers and sisters. Sometimes the relationship is good, sometimes not. We need to see what to do. And this is particularly important now in times of UN reform. And we also move big partnerships, for example, Alliance 8.7, Decent Jobs for Youth, the Global Deal. We are behind, some of these major initiatives as well. So let me start answer your question, Claude, by just telling you an anecdote. So in the final round of the negotiations of the SDGs, there was like kind of overnight negotiations, as you may know. So one delegate asked to delete the word full from the title of the SDG 8, full and productive employment, a decent work for all, saying that full employment is no longer an attainable objective. And then the chair asked the ILO to provide, technical clarification about the concept of full employment and whether it would be reasonable or not to include in the negotiations. And then I was the one in the room that I explained first what is full employment. It's not zero employment. That that there will always be some unemployment, and also that full employment is important to be considered as a long-term a macroeconomic objective, even if it's difficult to reach in the short term. It's important that it's included as part of the basis for the monetary and for the fiscal and growth policies, including the Federal Reserve has full employment as part of its mission statement. But I think after all technical argumentation, I think the most convincing argument it was when I said that full employment was actually included as part of the UN Charter, the UN Constitution, on the foundation of the UN in the 40s. That's precisely Article 55, and was repeated in various landmark UN resolutions since then. So my question back to the audience is that, so are you going to be the first generation, the generation that will give up on full employment? So that was my question to them. If you want to do so, it's your call. So immediately the chair said, okay, I don't think so. I don't think we'll be giving up on full employment. And then the delegate was also silent. So we saved full employment at that time. But this is a question that is coming back now, in particular in the discussion about the future of work. And I have, of course, some thoughts about that, but I understand we can discuss this in the second part. But let me say that we are in the year 2 of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So we are still in the beginning of the process. And we see, and one thing that we were concerned when we negotiated the agenda, when we finalized in 2015, the agenda was adopted, was, is this going to fly? So will countries buy in the agenda? Social partners and business and the rest of the world, will they adhere to the agenda or consider the agenda as a relevant mechanism. Because, as you know, it's a very complex agenda. There are 17 goals, 169 targets, 232 indicators. So it's, when we finalize all this criticism, say, okay, this is a dream. This is never going to happen. And what's happening now is precisely an unprecedented level of ownership and inclusion of the agenda in core, let's say, programming mechanisms. So if you look at, for example, the last UN General Assembly that happened here, there were 5 topics that were like a priority. If you look at all statements that were given by heads of state and also side events, of course, the first one is climate change. The second one is besides the SDGs. Then the third one was terror and peace and war and North Korea, everything that was related to the nuclear war. And then UNDS reform. So the SDGs are still like top in the concerns. In many countries are advancing in terms of internalizing the SDGs. So basically, they are doing 2 things. And we have already compiled information for something like 135 countries that are actually first make an assessment on whether their national plans, on their development plans, they match the SDGs. So looking at, their priorities and how far they are, there is an alignment between their plans and the SDGs and what should be done to promote this alignment. Some of them are asking the help of the UNs, others are doing it by their own, and this is happening both in developed countries and in developing countries. As you know, unlike the MDGs, the SDGs is a universal agenda. It's for everyone. So from Sweden, to Botswana, you have like this effort in terms of looking at their plans and see what they can do to match with the SDGs. So this is one thing. The second thing is, and this is quite clear in the HLPF. HLPF, as you know, is the high-level political forum. Countries, they come here to show what they are doing. So what they're at this stage, since we are in the early phases of implementation, what they're doing is first to establish structures, institutional structures. I was just talking to your colleagues in São Paulo yesterday in a conference promoted by the Turing Center. So we were looking at Latin America, for example, Colombia. Colombia established the Interinstitutional Commission, high-level Interinstitutional Commission for the alignment of the 2030 agenda and the plan. Mexico, the same, the National Council for the Agenda 2030. Argentina, they are building on already existing scheme, which is the National Social Policy Council. Brazil has just established a national commission for the SDGs as well. Chile, the National Council for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So all these countries, and this is happening all over the world. It's not only Latin America, Peru, the National Forum, Costa Rica, just to name a few. So at these early stages, it's very fundamental that social partners step up and say, okay, look, this is a discussion that is not only a governmental discussion. We need to have a seat on this table because this is precisely when these institutions are being created. And of course, they will, in the next 15 years, they will play a prominent role in terms of planning, but also in terms of the follow-up and review of the SDGs. So it's very, very important. And this is actually a national call because at some point we even discussed during the negotiations that there should be a kind of guidelines or how countries should structure themselves. And then they said, no, this is our business. We don't want anyone telling us how we will structure our institutions to implement, follow up, and review the SDGs. So this is a national struggle. So basically, some countries are more open. They are engaging in consultations with social partners, with civil society, with business. Others is just like an interministerial type of arrangement. So it varies a lot. In some cases, it's linked to the president or prime minister office. In other cases, linked to the minister of planning. So it varies. And it's also good. We need to give flexibility for countries to adapt according to their institutional characteristics and features. But one thing is very important, that we need now, you and us as well, we need to step up and say, okay, this should be an open process. It's not an indoors, governmental process, but the SDGs doesn't belong to the government; it belongs to the people, it belongs to a lot of us. It's our job to engage and also to make sure that what was agreed is being implemented. So in some countries, for example, they are establishing parliamentarian commissions. So in the same way there is a parliamentarian commission to oversee international affairs or to oversee social affairs, economic affairs, they're now establishing social development parliamentarian commissions to exercise oversight on the ability and on the capacity of the government to implement the SDGs. So this is quite important. At these early stages, we need to work very carefully in terms of in shaping up together this new generation of institutions that are coming up strongly. Another thing, so this is the government side. So a lot of enthusiasm, early stages, alignment with national plans, and alignment and creation of new institutions. On the business side, it's also very interesting because, and I don't think we expected that at this level, but there is an enormous level of buy-in, in particular big corporations, and they're trying to understand what it is, how they can contribute without just SDG washing, as they said, but and also institutional investors. So what are the mechanisms that are needed to link pension funds and insurance companies to investment in to impact investment, to investment that promotes impact in terms of sustainable development. So there is a lot of if you in September when DG was here, there was an ILO delegation here. So basically, a lot of the buzz, a lot of the movement was actually outside the UN. So you got, for example, Bill Gates, who had his own summit. Bloomberg had his own summit as well. Other CEOs, they were attending, which is on one hand a kind of there is a danger of kind of privatization of the policy, but on the other hand, it's also a signal of ownership. So basically, they are looking at it because the worst case scenario would be okay. Very interesting, UN, but thank you very much. We're doing our things and bye bye. So this is not what's happening. What's happening is an enormous level of buy-in and engagement from the governments first, or is on the lead, but also from business and big corporations and many groups. So I think trade unions have a very important role on this one as well, to step up both at national level and at global level and have a SDG implementation plan. So one can ask, well, what is let's say the global trade unions SDG implementation plan? So how are you supporting and it's okay if you say, no, we don't have one yet, because everybody's kind of asking themselves the same question, but they are preparing. So let's say in the first round of reviews, it's important to do what governments are doing, and others are doing, and the UN system as well. So the third element in this process is precisely the UN system. As you know, the ILO strategic plan for 18 to 2001 already matches our outcomes with the SDG. So if you look at the annex, you see exactly how each one of the outcomes contribute to the achievement of specific targets. So this is a quite important step, and everybody's doing the same. So the UNDP, UNFPA, UNICEF, they have just approved the UNDP is still to be approved, but they have just presented the strategic plans, and you can see exactly how each one of the actions of UNDP or UNICEF will be contributing to the achievement of specific targets and goals. So that's a kind of, and of course, all the issue about UN reform that everybody's concerned about, and the Secretary General is pretty much engaged in proposing a very structural and ambitious reforms in the UN system to make us work together and to enhance our capacity to support member states in the SDGs. So this is very core item in the agenda this semester and also the next semester when the resolution will be negotiated. So there is a kind of, it's like the SDGs were a kind of earthquake, and now everybody is, all these structures are being kind of being reaccommodated, to help in the delivery. But let me conclude, Claude, just by saying a few words about the importance of engaging, in particular, in the follow-up of review. Of course, because many of the targets are beyond, let's say, the what trade unions could do. No, I mean, it depends on, of course, on policies that you will have a role in influencing the policy, of course, but implementation is elsewhere. But you have a fundamental role in terms of making sure these policies are being implemented, and there's a follow-up and review mechanism. So basically, as you know, there is a global, let's say, follow-up and review mechanism that converges to the high-level political forum. So this is the moment the world comes together and asks the question, so how are we doing, right? There is a regional, and the regional commissions, they have a fundamental role, and Lais knows very well. So that's the moment that countries, they come together, social partners come together from learn to each other, so they have more time to go in depth in terms of analyzing the indicators, the good practices. So there's a lot of peer review and exchange of experiences. And there is the national level, which is by far the most important. That's where governments, they meet the voters, the citizens, the partners, and they discuss, okay, how are we doing, and what should we do to improve? How can we put? And this is again a national discussion that you have to be on the lead. You have to be one of the main, let's say, elements. Now, everything goes to the HOPF, as I said. So there's the national review that goes to this regional review, and in the end, it comes here to New York every year in July. There's 2 weeks of the HOPF. The G always come. So first week we look at specific goals. Of course, it's not possible to look at the entire agenda in just 1 week, right? So what they did was to select a specific set of goals that will be analyzed each year. So, for example, this year was Goal 1 on poverty, Goal 5 on gender, Goal 2 on hunger and nutrition, And next year will be more the environmental goals, so there'll be sustainable consumption and production, will be cities, energy, And then in 2019, there will be the so-called economic goals, including Goal 8 and Goal 10. And Goal 8, decent work, Goal 10, as you mentioned, inequalities. So basically, one core message here as well is that we need to get prepared for 2019. Not only because it's the ILO anniversary, and of course there is all the initiatives and the future of hope, but also because the world will be looking at this issue. So this is going to be the issue that will be at the center of the review agenda. So, and we need to be ready to step up and to say, so here is how we're doing at global level. Here's how we're doing at the national level and at the regional level. And I'm discussing, of course, with colleagues in Geneva that we need to improve, to enhance our capacities, to deliver these results. But also this is a discussion that will happen at the national level. So at the national level, this is the moment you can hold the government accountable to the promises and to the targets that were committed before. So and we can, since it's 2019, we can start early to prepare this review process of the SDG number 8. And it's very fundamental that we are equipped and that we are engaged in looking at the indicators, in looking at what's happening at the national level. And we have time, so that's the most important thing. When we were discussing how to sequence this results, they wanted to put SDG 8 first. They said, no, let's leave it to for 2 years. And so we have time to prepare a more substantive review. So that's something that it's very important to address as well. And finally, the issue of partnerships. So a lot of the implementation, since the SDGs are so multidimensional with multiple stakeholders, nobody will do it alone. So we need to join forces with others that are interested. And we have launched 5 major partnerships that are related to the SDGs. One is Alliance 8.7 on child labor, forced labor. The Equal Pay Coalition that was launched in New York this September as well, that promotes equal pay for work of equal value. The social protection floors, the universal social protection with the World Bank that was launched in 2016. The Decent Jobs for Youth initiative that also was launched in 2015. And the Global Deal for Decent Work, Inclusive Growth that is championed by the Prime Minister of Sweden and has the ILO and OECD as kind of informal secretariat. So, and this is very important, the engagement at the global level, but also at the national level in moving forward these partnerships is so important. So just very short takeaways. need to act with the governments at in the national level for the inclusion of social partners in the mechanisms that they are creating, need to stimulate parliamentarian control as well, need to participate in the process to review the SDGs both at national, regional, and global levels. In some cases, I mean, in the reviews, in the country reviews, in the voluntary national reviews, you see it's pure propaganda. No, some of them are even a joke. You say, well, how this person presenting this thing here? Because there is no accountability at the national level. There's no one to say, okay, maybe this is not wrong. So that's the moment when the civil society, the trade unions, and the others, they come and say, okay, maybe this is not wrong. I think it was very interesting in the last time. Some countries come up even with an independent or a kind of shadow evaluation. So this is something, if you're not able to influence the process, shadow evaluations could be also done. In some cases, trade unionists were part of the governmental delegation, so that's also important. I think it was Belgium who brought a trade unionist as part of the national delegation, and the person actually was able to intervene together with the minister when they were presenting the report. And finally, to participate in these partnerships and alliances, and let's start early to prepare for 2019 when SDG 8 and SDG 10 will be reviewed. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Vinicius, for this exhaustive presentation of what is happening from your perspective. Give now the floor to Ariel, ACTRAV's perspective on the issue.
Thank you. Just to also supplement what Vinicius has said, and also to pose some rather challenges and also way forward in terms of where we are on the SDGs. I think that the main start-off point is the 2017 report by the UN Secretary General, which also expressed concerns that the pace of progress that have been observed has been insufficient to meet the needs of the SDGs and the targets by 2030, and that the progress has not always been equitable and advancements are uneven across regions, between sexes, and among people of different ages, wealth, and locales, including urban and rural dwellers. Faster and more inclusive progress is needed to accomplish the bold vision articulated in Agenda 2030. Even the World Bank has also expressed that reaching targets and overcoming the challenges will require sharper focus on better financing, better data, and better methods of delivery. And that's why immediate action is important. Vinicius has mentioned a lot of the progress that has been achieved so far, and along these lines, we could also see progress in terms of the alignment of the SDGs with the development plans. For example, Australia, Germany, Uganda, and Colombia, they have all held multi-stakeholder processes that allow them to identify and to make the SDGs part and parcel of their national development agenda or national planning processes. And even in Europe, the Europe 2020 strategy, which replaces the Lisbon strategy, has put into track at least 100 of the SDG indicators integrated in the Europe 2020 strategy. But let me highlight also contribute to what Vinicius has said about the follow-up and review mechanism, which is, of course, the HLPF. In the HLPF, as has been described, there are voluntary national review processes that reports. These are reports that are received from member states on the implementation of 2030 agenda, regularly undertaken by both the developed and developing countries. And these VNRs serves as platforms for partnerships, including through participation of major groups and other relevant stakeholders. In 2016, there were 22 countries that were that submitted their VNRs, 9 in Europe, 2 Americans, 6 African countries, and 4 in Asia. This year, in 2017, there were 43 countries, except for 1 country which failed to submit their reports. 13 Europe, 10 America, 7 Africans, 2 Arab countries, and 10 countries in Asia. And for next year, already there are 48 countries that have submitted their voluntary national review reports. And this is where I think we should also pay close attention to, because most of the VNRs in a 2017 report for example, found that the strategies, including stock taking, mapping and gap analysis and identifying processes, and institutional coordination have been done. However, the challenges that have been identified along the lines of this report was that there has not been adequate stakeholder engagement. There has been overlapping responsibilities in obtaining data and updating indicators or creating new ones. Even when we closely looked at the voluntary national reviews that are available for, which is available because part of the SDG process is being transparent and accountable, we looked at 80 voluntary national reviews, and there is a preliminary attempt to look at references to trade unions in the voluntary national review processes. And out of the 82, only 17 countries have had references to trade unions in varying degrees. For example, and these 17 countries are 8 Europe, 5 Africa, 2 Asia, and 2 in the Arab states. Some of the notable mentioning of trade union references are, for example, the cases of Sweden, where there is a union-to-union strategy, whereby the Swedish trade unions are in the report, where, and it's mentioned that they will be providing other unions to support activities to ensure the SDG implementation. Some of the unions, for example, in Zimbabwe was part of the VNR preparation, and Estonia Trade Union Confederation is a member of the Sustainable Development Council, which is overseeing the implementation of the SDG in Estonia. And consultations have been done in Indonesia. Consultations with trade unions have been done in Indonesia, Philippines, Sierra Leone, Kenya, and Jordan, to name a few. So these are the most notable examples. But for example, when we did the course 2 weeks ago in Turin, where we had the trade union representatives from Russia and also the Arab states, we presented these sort of voluntary reports in the countries which have submitted the VNRs. And for example, there was a representative from Belarus. And the Belarus trade unionists amongst the participants read the report, and they were quite surprised that the way it was pictured in the report is a very rosy picture, and it did not really contain any of the challenges that workers and the Belarus workers and Belarus trade unions are facing. Not even any reference to what is happening in as far as violations of trade union rights and human rights in that country. So this is, I think, some of the things which we should all be highlighting, and I think food for thought for future action in as far as trade unions are concerned. In the HLPF this year, for example, there were from the ITUC 15-member delegation which participated in the HLPF. Some of them were, as Vinicius has mentioned, they were part of the official country delegations, and they have actively participated and engaged in the formal discussions. However, it was largely seen that there was very little space for union inputs and union voices to be heard in this big sort of assemblage of nations and government ministers, civil society representatives, members of businesses. So I think there has to be a deeper strategy and a more planned out strategy in terms of how we could use these processes and use these platforms and use these avenues to make the trade union voices louder and heard even better. For example, another area is the issue of the global indicator framework. And the global indicator framework, which is about 240 indicators where there are UN agencies as custodian agencies of the indicators, meaning that they should be able to track progress in terms of what data provided by national institutions submitted to, and also this whole methodology of measuring progress along the lines of these indicators. The ILO is custodian agency for 11 or 13 indicators, and that most of these are in Go Late. And a very particular indicator that relates to, and very importantly, for example, for trade unions, is the indicator on labor rights, and also the indicator 16.10.1, which is on where for the very first time in the indicator framework, you see a clear reference to trade unions, because indicator 16.10.1 talks about the number of journalists, trade unionists, and human rights defenders either killed, kidnapped, tortured, or victims of enforced disappearance. So I think these are, and countries are supposed to report on these sort of indicators. And here we see where could trade unions play a very important role in terms of, highlighting these sort of violations, making not only the countries but also the world understand about the situation which trade unionists face in the course of their work. So I think what ACTRAV is doing is also to make sure that, for example, in ACTRAV, we are helping support, and we are starting it, for example, this year, to look at how trade unions can become a united force in terms of pushing pushing commitments, pushing the governments and making them to do their promise in the Sustainable Development Agenda discussions at the country level. We're also making. We're also trying to convince, perhaps, maybe an area would be trade unionists actually being part of Sustainable Development Councils, sustainable development institutions that help, that implement and track progress, and also create policies along the lines of the SDGs. And also, of course, these broad-based, building broad-based networks with civil society. One of the things which was mentioned earlier was also about the shadow reports, and I think the beauty of the shadow reports is it also helps as an advocacy tool in terms of putting governments and putting member states accountable to certain things in relation to social dialogue, in relation to the issue of trade union rights, and also in relation to the issues around decent work. This is a good tool, and I think this has to be continued. But I think this has to be part of a bigger strategy or a bigger process for unions in order to be able to make their presence really felt in this SDG discussions and SDG implementation. So I'd like to end by saying, by asking the question: can we get there? Can this vision of a better world be achieved? Maybe we can, and maybe we should. But of course, the strategies and I think the actions that are required should not be business as usual, and it may require us to work differently. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ariel. You mentioned 1610.1.
Yeah.
I think that the trade union movement owes a lot to Vinicius, because he really pushed for that one. I remember very, very well. And so thank you. So now we've gone through the first round of discussions around the 2030 agenda, what it entails, the importance of having a shift in development paradigm. But how does it relate to this discussion we're having on the future of work? What is the relationship to it? And how can we ensure that the agenda takes on board all the concerns and all the challenges we've identified over the last couple of days around the future of work? And eventually, what is the role of unions in that? So I'll give the floor again to the speakers. I'd however, request that if you could please keep it quite short. I mean, very 5 minutes. And if you're going beyond 5 minutes, I'll show you not a red card, a white card, just to remind you to kind of begin to wind up, so that we give participants a chance also to engage in the discussion. Light, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Bueno,
Yes. I'm going to try to speak less than 5 minutes, but I think that's a very good question. I would start, again, I mean, what we've been discussing here on the future of work throughout these few days, and I think this discussion which is being held in the ILO, which is extremely important, I retain two central ideas from these discussions. One, that the challenges are major, and if you associate these challenges with Agenda 2030, with their central objective of eradication of poverty in all its forms, in all its places, without leaving anyone behind, which is a very ambitious objective on the international agenda, ambitious in a good meaning of the word. What we've been analyzing over these few days is that the current changes in the world of work, which have already occurred, and those which will very probably occur, this have to do with new forms of technology, as well as the need to change the model of consumption and production, thinking of environmental sustainability. How the whole series of problems in the workplace, which we've been discussing, the trend is toward more complex and more serious challenges and problems. At the same time, what we've said, and I think it's very important to keep this in mind, that there is a space for policy and negotiation. As was said today, that there's no direct and necessary link between technological change and employment. This is mediated through processes, through institutions, and the relations of power. I think this is very important to remember. There is a space for collective action. There is a space for public policy. There is a space for trade union action and for social dialogue. So, as Vinicius as well as Ariel have mentioned in their comments, the importance of trade unions and the social players, but here we're talking about the trade unions. It's very important for them to participate actively in this process. It's not a process just to be involved in governments, but it's a social process to reassert the need to strengthen the decent work agenda and all this process. I would say that this is a key focus. I know that the ILO has been doing very important work, not just in defending Objective 8, which was already major, but also to ensure the cross-cutting nature of decent work. That is, to ensure that it's contained throughout the Agenda 2030 agenda. In ACTRAV, we're trying to ensure that there's an explicit social dimension to the SDGs, but if we don't take account of the social dimension in the whole 2030 agenda, we're not going to be able to fulfill the SDGs, because as the coordinator said, there is something very innovative, which is to consider the social and economic dimension as part of this. But we know that in practice, we don't have the economic and macro objective economics. We know that they predominate over the social objectives. So we have to guarantee effective equality of these issues. But this is a real challenge. In other words, the extended social pillar of Agenda 20 it means that if we don't take account of the particular social issues, we won't be able to comply with sustainable development, but we also will not be able to achieve the explicit sustainable development goals, including economic objectives. That is, the labor pillar, or the decent work pillar within the Agenda 2030, has to be considered in all its dimensions. And how, if we don't make progress in, that is, improving working conditions, extending social coverage and social protection, the guaranteeing labor laws, progress that might exist, that is, in eradicating poverty and famine, we will fail. Once again, in Latin America, we made progress in eradicating poverty. We made progress in eradicating famine, but we still, the unemployment rate is increased by 1.3%. And increase the informalization of the labor market. So this is an important look to have. That's an important consideration for the trade unions. And this is why they should participate in the 3 levels in ECLAC, as we've said, in the economic commissions, in the UN Secretariat. The UN has a very important role to play in the regional implementation of Agenda 2030. We created a forum, a sustainable development forum, that was met in Mexico in May, and it's going to meet next year. And these were important fora to ensure the trade union perspective, the international, regional, national trade union movement, to analyze this process. And it's important to say that if we don't make progress in universal health coverage and universal access to education, universal social protection, guaranteeing the rights of workers, men and women, and ensuring progress and ensuring economic growth, that would be a major contribution on the part of trade unions, which might also help to make more concrete what we're talking about when we're talking about the SDGs. Who are we talking about? Who are we aimed at? Of course, in other words, we keep saying, let's not leave anyone behind. That's what we mean. Who are the ones who are the most excluded? Well, they're persons who working at the very end of the supply chain, who don't have are not covered by a single ILO convention. So this perspective is a very important one to keep in mind. And I think here, once again, ECLAC is very open to contributing to this discussion in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also into other international fora, with the work that we're doing, that is, of accompanying the compliance and the preparation of indicators. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lies, for that. Vinicius, you have the floor.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'll be very quick on this one, because I know we've been discussing this issue for a while. But just to say that when I had that discussion with the delegate, actually, since Ariel just mentioned countries, I also mentioned, was the UK delegate who wanted to kill full employment in the text. So when I had the discussion, there was this thing, okay, full employment should be, I mean, there was no question in the room that everybody was convinced that full employment should be an attainable objective. But now this question is coming again. Here in New York, to some extent at the UN, we just had a session, the second committee, and with the ECOSOC, and one of the invitees was precisely a robot that was a part of the panel, Sophia. It was a quite an interesting and weird interaction with the other panelists. So basically using artificial intelligence as part of the UN, let's say, processes. But the question is very strong, actually, how structural changes in the labor market, driven mostly by technology, but also by other things, can undermine the ability to deliver on the full employment promise, and how, not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality of jobs. So is full employment still an attainable objective in the context of the 2030 agenda? And that's precisely where the future of work meets the 2030 agenda. No? So as part of this reflection that we need to have towards 2030. And let me offer very quickly 3 insights. Okay, and this is not only what the impressions that I have discussing this issue with my colleagues the UN, but also attending some of the tech let's say, conferences here in New York. Sometimes they invite me to speak and to offer my insights. So I'm in kind of in dialogue with this, with the millennials and people that are working on these issues, and in particular on the tech industry, right? And one thing that we discussed precisely this week in the G20 Development Working Group, by the way, was that while in the incorporation of technology in the production process is exponential and is disruptive, the realization of labor rights is linear and incremental. So it takes like 2-3 years to incorporate entire new technology in a supply chain process, for example, or in a productive process in general. But it takes decades, to extend labor rights and social rights. So state social protection, 5 decades, For a country to allow, for example, maternity leave, it's decades of struggle, and you know that very well. So at some point, we need to find a balance between these two processes. So it's so easy to destroy, labor rights because the incorporation of technology is so exponential, it's so fast. But on the other hand, the realization of labor rights is part of a political process, which takes time, it takes struggles, it takes, efforts, from all parts. So we need to think carefully about these two dynamics. My second point, and this is something I always remind people, is while dealing with the future of work, we should also not lose sight of the ghosts from the past. So basically, just look at the numbers. There are many more child laborers today in the workforce than people working in the gig economy. So gig economy in the US, for example, is 0.5% of the workforce, according to Alan Kruger's from Princeton study. So let's, there's a lot of attention on this particular, structural change that is happening, that is important, but we shouldn't use this to distract from our, 19th century tasks that still need to be achieved. So that's my second point. My third point, and this is very important for you and for us, this is a very crowded space. So in particular, when I talk to my millennials in this conference, many are even questioning the capacity and the ability of the current institutions, institutional frameworks, to deal with these emerging issues. So, for example, in the recent tech conference I attended at NYU, there was a strong reaction against the establishment. And I realized that I was part of the establishment. ILO has always been progressive, and even the UN, but you are the establishment, And they even say, actually, they even question this idea that there is a fourth industrial revolution, because this revolution, these changes, they are not industrial at all. It's a digital phase, it's a digital era. And all the institutions that we have, they belong to the industrial era. They belong to the past. And they're not capable to deal with the emerging types of challenges. So this is quite worrying, because, of course, our norms and standards, they are questioned. The role of trade unions as well under stake. So And this is part of the challenge that we have as well, to renew ourselves. So to get more participation of young people and millennials in trade unions, to open up to new technologies in terms of how to organize yourselves and ourselves. So this is quite important because the millennials of today, of course, they will grow up as well, and they will take the positions. And if they don't believe in the institutions of the 20th century, the institutions that were created to cope, let's say, with the Industrial Revolution, they'll just ignore them, and they'll do their own regulations. For example, I was just talking to a group. They wanted to regulate crowdsourcing in supply chain, so they want to look at. And they'll say, okay, but then I said, okay, but we're having this discussion at the ILO, perhaps 2019, and there's a commission, etc., and there will be the IOC. Maybe in the future there will. 2019 is way, beyond their planning time frame. No, we'll do this in 3 months. We have a new standard, and then we negotiate with Google and Facebook, and and with the big five, and then it's done. So we need to. This is a kind of wake-up call, I think, for us, because we are being questioned as people from the industrial age, from the structures of the past of the industrial. We're being questioned in terms of our capacity to deliver. So it's a very crowded space. A lot of players, a lot of young people that are really keen to do things. In their time frames, they can't wait. Their time frames are much shorter than our time frames. So I leave you with these 3 reflections.
Thank you so much. Very provocative. So, Ariel.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, I think we all know that the 2030 declaration does not make any reference to the future of work as such. But of course, if we look closely into the Future of Work Centenary Initiative document, there are several times that the importance of the 2030 agenda for future generations and the future of humanity are mentioned in the entire text. So the 2030 agenda and the future of work are symbiotic processes that perhaps in that they are attempting to map challenges and solutions in a similar time zone. And now it becomes this is becoming more relevant because there are in process now in a lot of countries the UN Development Assistance Framework processes, and that they are also trying to prepare a Vision 2030 document. And here I think is where the convergence of the future of work and the 2030 agenda can come in, because the scope of the future of work is so broad, and that it has its own linkages with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And of particular relevance to these would be SDG targets 8.4 on resource efficiency, SDG 9.B on technology, SDG 17.6 on access to science, technology, and innovation, SDG 17.8 on technology bank, and 17.11 on exports by least developed countries. So I think these linkages should find its way in the debate, in the discussions around how we will be able to frame the UN Development Assistance Framework in country processes, and also finding its way in decent work country programming processes that are also taking place in many countries today. But I think what could also be important is that the DG has also the ILO has also just launched the work of the Commission, the Commission on the Future of Work. And here I think there is a space where perhaps and I understand national consultations or national dialogues will again be part of the way or the methodology, the working of the Commission will be. So I think the trade unions can again find space in terms of how these linkages, the symbiotic processes of the future of work and the SDGs can take place. Let us not forget that the SDGs are shared development visions for constituents, and their aspirations in relation to the future of work we want. They also provide a starting point for planning for sharper and more strategic actions, and they provide an opportunity for partnerships and also basis for resource mobilizations. But more importantly, the 2030 agenda is something that is a historic achievement in itself, that in that the world leaders have promised to deliver them. So I think there is a responsibility, there is action required to hold world leaders or governments responsible to that promise, to make them accountable, and demand a different path, and also to choose the world we want, and eventually the future of work we want. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all of you. But now I'll give the floor to our discussant, Sonia. A few reflections on your end, then we'll open the floor for comments, reflections from participants. But first of all, Tonia.
Thank you very much indeed to ACTRAV for inviting me to the symposium, and also for giving me a chance to act as a discussant at very short notice. So thank you very much indeed. I'm a professor of law at the University of Bristol, and I'm heavily involved in a new project which was set up in 2016 called Sustainable Market Actors for Responsible Trade. And at the moment, we're mapping the international and European legal and policy dimensions, and then we're going to trace supply chains, looking in particular at mobile phones and textiles. The project will finish in 2020, and it looks at the relationship between the EU and countries of the Global South in terms of trade, finance, and investment. And I think what I'd like to do briefly, because I don't think it's been quite mentioned here yet, is to share some thoughts about the interaction between trade, finance, and investment, and how that could relate to the Sustainable Development Goals and the project of the ILO. So obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals reflect a very important and significant global consensus. And what's more, the inclusion of SDG 8 and this reference to decent work amounts to a really important recognition of the ILO's agenda and the 2008 declaration. What is curious, though, I suppose, about the SDGs, and when you look at the wording of SDG 8, is that, of course, it isn't just about decent work in isolation, but in relation to the drivers of economic growth and full employment. SDG 8A is interesting because it also says that we need to start in this context partnering trade with aid in many ways, as Lais was saying, so as to create diversification of certain economies. And I think when we talk about supply chains and the problems with supply chains, or we talk about the digital economy and the future of work, we often talk about these as if they are somehow lying in isolation from international trade and investment regimes. So if you look at the controversy over Uber services in Europe at the moment, and this big question as to whether or not they are a transport service or whether they're to be regulated as an information service, that makes a huge difference in terms of the norms that apply to them for workers' rights and in terms of competition law as well. Well, the same thing is happening with Amazon and digital platforms. And what that raises for us is the possibility that when we think about the exploitation of those people who are not even counted as workers at the end of supply chains, when we think about migrants who are working across spaces in terms of the use of GATS and trade and services, that we may not be always needing to think about regulating labour standards per se, and we might not be quite so critical of the actions of trade unions, because it may not be the reform of labour standards that's always required. There is tremendous scope here to think about current investment regimes which operate along the line of private international law, bilateral investment treaties that protect the legitimate expectations of investors and block forms of environmental reform, but also social and labour reforms within particular states. In the same way, the General Agreement on Trade and Services creates an annex on the free movement of natural persons that doesn't even begin to address labour standards, which is really strange when you think about it. And also, the WTO admits and permits these nice mega-regional trade agreements which now contain competition and procurement clauses that profoundly affects what happens to workers in particular states. So is this any business of the ILO and workers' movements? Well, workers' movements have been actively campaigning for reform, and so have developing states. And if you think about the origins of the ILO and the role of the Declaration of Philadelphia, this idea that economic and financial policies must be evaluated according to whether they promote social justice, well, we've got a statement of social justice in the SDGs. They may be imperfect in various respects, but they are what we have as our global consensus, and they're a real touchstone for us. So it seems to me that there is scope for operation here, and I just wanted to sound a note of caution as well in terms of the ghosts from the past that was mentioned before. We have seen trade imbalances, investment shocks, beggar thy neighbour problems in terms of currency speculation back in the 1930s. And the Declaration of Philadelphia was a response to that. Today, we have extreme nationalism emerging in countries like the UK, which is not only opposed to setting full employment as a labour standard, but wants to leave the entirety of the EU at the moment. We have America first in the US. We have problems in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. It seems to me that we're under threat of a kind of nationalism and fragmentation that threatens the international solidarity of the SDGs and also the raison d'etre of the International Labour Organization. And I think it's time that we could mobilize against that. And just to point out that SDG 17, which signals the importance of equitable trade, is actually up for review every year at the HLPF. So if the ILO and ACTRAV could feed into that every year, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tonya, for those useful remarks. Now you have the floor. And I'd really appreciate it also if we could talk also about what trade unions can do, what trade unions are doing, and linking these 2030 agenda and future of work issues, and also responding a bit also to what the challenges that were posed by the panelists on participation, on the spaces for participation, and how we can engage in these spaces. Yes, Anthony.
Thanks, Claude. First of all, the question about whether we can achieve the SDGs. Our response is that the development challenges, especially in Africa, are huge, and doing nothing is not one of the options. And so we have to keep trying. And that is why I think the SDGs are important. And for us in Africa, there was a vacuum in the 80s and 90s, and we didn't have such a framework which has global buy-in, especially at the initiative of the UN. And because we didn't have that, we have IMF and the World Bank taking over and giving us the poverty reduction strategies and so on. It didn't work out, it didn't help. So the SDGs are an important framework that becomes a benchmark for us trade unions to challenge IMF and say, this is not in the SDGs. This is not consistent with the SDGs. And this, for me, is key. But unfortunately, not many unionists across Africa know about SDGs, unfortunately. I'm sorry. Therefore, taking from what happened during the PRSPs, and Claude, you may recall that ILO played a key role in getting the unions to participate in the PRSPs. And I remember working with you a lot on papers on PRSPs. ITUC actually developed a model for the unions so that we can, on the basis of the model, participate in the PRSPs. That really helped. I remember a document that ITUC developed, which sampled features of our PRSPs across Africa, and we could see something happening. And this is the kind of support we expect from the ILO and ITUC. OATU, Organization of African Trade Union Unity, in the 1990s, developed what we call the AFSAP, Alternative Framework for Structural Adjustment Policies. And the unions that are affiliated to Organization of African Trade Union Unity bought into this and used it to challenge governments and World Bank and IMF and so on. So we expect a lot because unions, some describe us as historical passovers, and we don't have the capacity to deal with these technical issues. And therefore, if you have the ILO, we have the ITUC, we expect, and of course, Organization of African Trade Union Unity in Africa, we expect a lot of support, this technical support. Financial support, I won't talk about it, but technical support is what we need now. And I can assure you, if we get that, unions, whatever it is, how weak we are still a big force in Africa. And I can assure you that among civil society organizations, apart from the churches that are promising their members heaven, we are the only ones promising food on the table. And therefore, if you are talking about sustainable development goals, which has nothing to do with afterlife, then the trade unions must be at the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna.
Yes, thank you, Claude, and thank you to all the intervention. I have a couple of questions about not about the SDGs. I think everybody agrees about the SDGs are fantastic. But where I have, and I usually I'm the devil's advocate on this, it's the method of implementation. You know, I think that honestly, and first of all, I want also to thank Vinicius for fighting for the full employment. I think that from an ILO perspective, we stick to all the three dimensions of Convention 122, full, productive, freely chosen. And we have discussed a lot about how, you know, the precarious work is the non-freely chosen employment. So we want to have that piece in the work. But my problem is indeed this fragmentation and new method of implementation. For example, these new national voluntary reviews and everything. We discussed this morning that the fragmentation of companies is a factor that has fragilized the social rights. And the fact that, you know, workers need always to catch up. And to me, you know, it's like it's what Tonya was saying, you know, the SDG should apply. You know, we should discuss, you know, national policy, bilateral treaties, trade agreement, not to create new structure, because that's where, you know, the unions have to run in order to be there. And maybe they are invited, maybe are not invited. And also the other thing I want to ask, so this is where I think we should insist, and I hope that since the future of work has been called a frontier issue, you know, the other day the Director General told us this in the UN, you know, I think the ILO should come there. And then I think we should have taken the example that Ariel said about Belarus. We need to have a way for the ILO per se, including its supervisory mechanism, to say which is the status compared to international labor standards of countries. Because, you know, just like if we simply is something that it can be there or it cannot be there, you know, it's just like I think that because it's the UN family, it's the UN system, the ILO has to participate as such, including in the supervision of the standards and the application in the different countries.
Thank you, Anna. Abdullah, you have the floor. Yeah.
Merci, donc.
I'd like to thank the moderator, and I have three things to say. The African Union has already adopted
all the principles contained in the SDGs. The Social and Economic and Labour Commission of the African Union, which is a tripartite committee involving governments, employers, and the two trade unions, OATUU and CISA Africa, are represented. And this item was on the agenda of their last meeting. In other words, in Africa, we have a problem. The governments and regional governments adopt a lot of things. But when it comes to actually implementing and spreading word of what's been adopted, unfortunately, this task ought to be a priority as well. Even the ILO a lot of countries are concerned by the decent work country programs. But the implementation of what's been adopted in the 22 countries chosen, the governments of many countries who've signed and said they were in agreement, are today raising difficulties in implementing what was decided on. And as our colleague from Ghana said, we need technical support, technical assistance to enable the trade union organizations to be able to negotiate and discuss things, discuss these substantive issues with the governments, because it's not just enough to sit down at the negotiating table. If you don't have the necessary knowledge or experience, if that's missing, people will take advantage of your ignorance and do whatever they like. In conclusion, that since the SDGs are part of the future of work, trade union organizations should go on the offensive. They should take initiatives, be creative, and be united in action so that the work that we want is no longer slavery as it was in the last century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdullahi. We still have some time for other contributions, other comments and questions. And yes.
Thank you. Merci, Claude.
Thank you, Claude. I'm more interested in the point you made about the relationship between the future of work and the SDGs. If we take as our starting point an empirical analysis and say that on the basis of statistics that are starting to be published, that technological progress is going to lead to loss of jobs at a fairly high level, then we say immediately that that contradicts SDG 8, because there we talk about decent work, we talk about growth of employment, overcoming poverty in other goals. But if a lot of workers are going to lose their jobs, going to lose their income, even if there are other possibilities for creating jobs, it does seem that there's a kind of contradiction there. Even so, I think, as Ariel has said, there's the idea of the possibility of linking what we hope for as regards future work should be linked to our expectations of the SDGs. What's important now is the following. The sources of decisions. That's totally political. At what level of political decision-making or on what political platform is it possible to achieve this link-up so that the new technologies and the digital economy don't just obey profit, but go in the direction of what Mrs. Lais was saying, how to replace the culture of privilege by the culture of equality. I think if we achieved that, we would achieve our goals. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else?
Sorry. Thank you, Claude. I'd just like to offer 3 comments. Firstly, in relation specifically to social dialogue, we heard from Dr. Lustenau yesterday, I think, the example of the political decision taken in Uruguay to put the social policy up there with the economic policy, and to do that seriously and to reinforce it with tripartite social dialogue and a number of other measures, I think beginning in 2005. So while I was listening to him, I went on to look at economic indicators for Uruguay. And what we see actually from the World Bank statistics is a massive growth in GDP that started around that time, and a huge reduction in poverty that also started around that time. So we're not just talking abstract philosophy here, this is actual real-world experience that runs contrary to the policies that are being dictated by the IFIs themselves and adopted by many governments, often as a result of corporate pressure. So I'd like to offer that observation because I think it's really a very illustrative case of where the future of work should be heading. The second observation I'd offer is in relation to social dialogue and the question of collective bargaining density. And we hear this also from the sort of Bretton Woods set quite often. The notion that declining trade union density is somehow a secular phenomenon, that it's happening magically and that it's a product of nature. Absolute rubbish. It's a product of hostility by employers, and it's a product of weak and to some extent incompetent decisions by government, who are simply folding under the pressure again of corporate lobbies. The decline in trade union density, we have questions to answer ourselves as trade unions, obviously, and there are other factors, but these are the results of deliberate political decisions. And my third comment goes to the questions of trade agreements, which were raised earlier. If we have a look at the implications of TISA and the e-commerce agenda, that's a whole-scale elimination of government authority and the capacity of governments to legislate and to make rules. In the briefing that the ITUC's produced, which we'll make available to people, we put that alert in a series of regulatory issues that we believe are central to managing the future of work in a way that's going to reduce and not increase inequality in the world, and that's going to actually generate more jobs through people's own purchasing power. So we are pressing some warning buttons about the kind of the determinist nature. We heard from our Russian colleague yesterday a rejection of this notion of artificial intelligence. Well, I don't believe in this concept of artificial intelligence. Yes, you may be on a panel with a robot or a computer. Can it join this conversation effectively? Not really. We are being conditioned to think things by others, and we need to question some of those concepts in the same way that we need to question this notion that somehow the decline in collective bargaining density is somehow a secular issue. It's a product of political decisions. So that's just 3 comments I'd like to offer. Thank you, Claude.
Well, thank you all so very much. Before we end, I'd like to give the floor to our panelists in 1-2 minutes. Concluding remarks before we wrap up. Who'd like to take the floor? Lice?
Bueno, no sé si son...
Well, I don't know whether these are conclusions, but I just wanted to take up one point when we were talking about means for implementation. I talked about financing, public investment, the resources that we need from the tax system. I'd like to talk about statistics. That was also mentioned here. And to come back to this morning's discussion of how to make visible those who are invisible in this world of work that's very much fragmented. The role of trade unions and the ILO is very important. The trade unions have to help to make visible those who are invisible. I repeat, if we want to comply with the main purpose of Agenda 2030, that nobody should be left out, that's central. We're looking at this in ACTRAV. One of the SDGs, 17.8, says that all the data have to be broken down by sex, gender, etc., etc. Now, every word counts, as Vinicius said. Whether or not we have full employment is very important. It has political implications. We did an exercise. Of course, when you say decent work, that means work for all. But we know that that's very often not enough. So we did this exercise of studying which groups of the population appeared explicitly in the goals. And there's a great deal of difference here. There are men and women. Gender is important. Children appear. The poor and vulnerable. But there's very little mention of migrants, indigenous peoples, peoples with disabilities hardly appear at all. There are 130 million people of African descent in Latin America, who were the people who were subject to slavery. And these do not appear in the SDGs. There's not a single reference in the goals to them. I know this is different in Latin America and in other countries, but anyway, just to take a few examples, if, for example, this was something ACTRAV did, because one of its purposes is to look at Latin America. What is the statistics capacity existing today in Latin America in order to provide information using all these breakdowns? Then breaking down things by sex, that was also very important because of everything to do with gender. The breakdown by age. That's possible too under present statistical systems, but other things are being left out. So if we don't have that data, we're not going to know whether we're making any progress on the goals. We have to pinpoint progress, but also where we've gone back as well. You're going to tell me, well, what about statistical organizations? Obviously, we have the Labour Statisticians Conference that's organized by the ILO. So that's yet another space that's very important for us to link the discussion on the future of work with how to make these people visible, who are invisible, to ensure that there's this control, there is checks by society on what the governments are actually doing. So I'm just throwing out these thoughts for you. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Now, just some final thoughts. I can't hear you, but if you can hear me, that's fine. First, the question that Anna posed about the role of ILO in terms of reporting with respect to compliance with labor standards. Actually, when we help designing this entire, let's say, follow-up and review architecture, we've put a space for that. So if you look at, of course, target 8.8 has to do with labor rights, and the indicator 8.8.2, it says level of national compliance of labor rights, and then in parentheses, freedom of association, collective bargaining. based on the International Labour Organization textual sources and national legislation. Okay, so we are narrowing down a little bit to freedom of association, collective bargaining here, but this indicator can have a broad, let's say, interpretation. So basically, if you want to report results of cases to the HLPF, we have the space in this indicator. And actually, every year, the president of the ECOSOC, which is the chair of the HLPF, invites the ILO to provide technical inputs. So you remember this year, there was a discussion in the governing body, and on the basis of that discussion, we provided inputs to the HLPF. So there is an institutional, let's say, a space for us to convey, to the HLPF, to the UN, information about respect, about national compliance with labor standards using our supervisory mechanisms. But I think we need to figure out how to use this better. In particular, towards 2019. As I said, 2019, SDG 8 and 10 will be reviewed. So by that time, we should be able also to provide not only some indicators and some analysis, but also some information in terms of national compliance with respect to labor rights. So this is one point. My second point is with respect to what was mentioned on the. Of course, I mean the Agenda 2030 and the future of work, they meet precisely on the issue of future of full employment, full productive employment, decent work for all. Because if this is the promise for 2030, and some, let's say, structural trends will affect this promise, so there's clearly a convergence between the two issues. And the way to look at it, we have to ask ourselves. So it's the same question that I asked to the UK delegate, to the rest of the delegates. So are we going to be the generation that will give up on full employment, or let's have full employment as the standard, and then let's adjust the other trends? So that's the kind of policy debate that we have. And the roles of trade unions are extremely important. But in order to remain relevant, and this is quite important, we need also to listen and to connect with the emerging, constituencies. We just had at the IMF, the annual meetings, we had this panel with Deborah Greenfield and Sarah Horowitz. Sarah Horowitz is the president of the Freelancers Union here in New York. And she's bringing very interesting things to the table. For example, Lais mentioned the issue of the invisible work, those who are invisible in the role of trade unions are made invisible. But with the technology, the broad scope of the invisible work has been enhanced at levels that are not even measurable. Now, so people working from home, connected to these task-based platforms, we don't know even what they are, who they are, and where they are. Maybe So there's the incorporation of ICTs and the technological change and digitalization is creating new forms of invisible work. So what can we do, or what can you do as trade unions to reach out to these groups? And then there are things, for example, she was saying, look, the unions, they deal with people with permanent jobs in general. In my constituents, normally, in average, there is a turnover in terms of new employees, in terms of changing jobs, which is 7 a year. So 7 times they change jobs, because they are task-based, they're serving one company, then they go to the other one every month, and they say, and they say, look, there is an issue of non-payment. So 30% of the work that we do is actually free, because there's default. Some of the startups that just want to go bankruptcy, and people don't get paid. So what should and of course, if you want to get paid, you have to go to justice. There are costs. So in average, from the 7 jobs, 3, or 2 will not pay. So what can we do, as the unions, to mobilize, to reach out to these groups? The issue of portability of Social Security. How can Social Security be portable in tasks? Of course, new emerging occupational safety and health issues, and the issue of representation. So all these things, should be used also to stimulate our internal discussions and to reflect on how can we become relevant for these constituencies as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Ariel.
Very, very quickly. I think let me just highlight the fact that the SDGs, one of the characteristics is its indivisibility, which means that they cannot be positioned, they cannot in a hierarchical or a prioritization model. And the denial of one invariably impedes on the enjoyment of other rights and basic needs. So I think these characteristics of the SDG we should always remember. And I think when we talk to when we talk to national governments and when we exact national political will, I think this is where we should the message should be clear, I think. And stronger capacities are required in order for us to fully implement the SDGs. And I think here, the ILO and the trade union movement can perhaps find a way to address these capacity gap issues, but also more importantly, the stronger partnership. The indivisibility of the SDGs would allow partnerships from across range, and I think across range of sectors or groups, and that we are able to also partner with other groups in terms of how we can move on in the SDG with the SDG agenda. But I think the critical issue here is the issue of data. Data becomes a prerequisite for proper national ownership and implementation. And in areas where data is not reliable, where there's not confidence in data, and I think here again is where trade unions could perhaps be able to, make national governments pay attention to these very important concerns. So I end with that, and thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you all very much. I'd just like to end by just saying very simply. Two thoughts that I go away with. The first thought is that the current projections on the future of work are based on the current development model that we have. And we know it's a very imperfect development model, and therefore it's no surprise that it's producing very imperfect and very undesirable outcomes in terms of what the future of work will look like. And so to have a favorable future of work, we must have a favorable development model, a development paradigm. And this is very, very important. And I think, so this is an important contribution of ACTRAV to the debates in the House, because some in the House have been looking at it as how do we get palliatives? How do we put in plaster on the sores and move forward? But the real issue is how do we have a favorable development model which will give us favorable outcomes? The second point is basically that there's nothing inevitable about the future of work. There's nothing inevitable about it. And I like very much what you said, Lais. There's a space for political action. There's space for social dialogue. There's space for political action. And I think it was a great thing that you started a symposium by a session on political action. What is the role of politics in this debate? So this is very, 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 very important. And then now, as you go back home, the ball is in your court. There are national institutions, like Vinicius said. Countries are building up national institutions for SDG, national SDG strategies. It's up to you to engage, to get involved, to shape it, to make sure that there are policies that are being promoted that are consistent with a decent work agenda and decent work objectives. I'd like to thank all the panelists, Lais, Ariel, Vinicius, Tonia, thank you so much. Thank you also for your participation. Thank you to the interpreters, and thank you for inviting me.
Claude, sorry, I'm taking the floor 1 second to thank you again, just to remind everybody that if you leave this afternoon, if you are registered to stay until tomorrow, stay and be here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. It will be a session with the Director General. But for those who leave